The streetlights of suburban Sacramento flickered like hesitant witnesses to something terrible. In one quiet cul-de-sac, a young couple slept unaware as someone moved through their backyard, silent as a shadow in slow motion. Not a breath was heard. Not a floorboard creaked under his steps. Yet the air itself seemed to shiver with expectation. Doors that were supposed to protect now invited intrusion. Locks became jokes. No one saw him arrive. No one saw him leave. And for decades, this invisible predator, the man later called the Golden State Killer, slipped through the rhythms of ordinary life like smoke through fingers. His presence was never announced, only sensed. A faint shuffle in the night, a phone that rang with only static and a whisper, a glance in the window that wasn't supposed to be there. Families would wake to the faintest traces of violation. A chair moved, a drawer left slightly open, a light burning that shouldn't have been. He didn't just take, he orchestrated fear, a quiet symphony performed in homes where trust should have been absolute. And yet, for over 40 years, he vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind a residue of dread, unanswered questions, and the eerie certainty that someone or something was watching. California thought it knew safety, but he knew every routine, every habit, every fear. And even as the decades passed, that knowledge stayed alive, waiting for the day when patience, obsession, and science would finally converge, and the invisible man would be revealed. The phone call was short, a whisper more than a voice. "You'll never catch me." Then a low chuckle, like air squeezed from a punctured tire, and silence. That was it. No name, no demand, just a reminder. A phantom tapping on the shoulder of California's terrified suburbs in the late 70s. Police traced the call. Of course, they always did. Dead end. It had come from a payphone 2 towns away. A receiver still swinging, no fingerprints, no one lingering in sight. For months before and after, that was his game. A man unseen but everywhere. He prowled bedrooms. He studied family routines. He knew which houses had sliding glass doors that never locked properly. He wasn't a ghost. Ghosts don't eat leftovers from your refrigerator or rummage through your underwear drawer before tying you up. He was flesh and blood, but he played the role of nightmare with the precision of an actor rehearsing his lines. One victim swore she heard him humming to himself while she lay frozen, bound, unable to scream. Another claimed he spoke through clenched teeth, a whisper and a hiss that seemed designed to burrow under the skin. And always there was that mask, plain, cheap, expressionless. The kind of thing you'd see in a 5 and dime Halloween aisle, transformed into something infinitely more menacing when paired with his ritual. Decades later, detectives would admit, off the record, that what shook them wasn't just a cruelty. It was the patience. The way he'd stand at the edge of a bed for hours, waiting for a victim to wake, as though the stillness itself was part of the punishment. He could have struck fast, left quickly, but no. He lingered, breathing into the darkness, feeding off the terror his silence created. Imagine knowing that someone was in your house, not just for a minute, but for hours. Imagine the weight of footsteps behind you, but never seeing who cast them. And then imagine that man disappearing into the night, leaving nothing behind but a broken lock, a torn piece of cloth, and a phone that would ring days later just to remind you he was still out there. This was not a single crime, nor even a string of crimes. This was a career of torment spread across decades, stitched together by one man's hunger for control. And for more than 40 years, California slept uneasily, haunted by the faceless predator who would come to be known by many names, until one stuck like dry blood, the Golden State Killer. California in the mid-1970s was supposed to be sunshine and avocado toast before avocado toast existed. The American dream with palm trees. Young families bought tidy suburban homes, the kind with shag carpets and station wagons in the driveways. Children rode bikes without helmets, the boom of new shopping centers and cul-de-sacs ringing like a promise that life could only get safer, easier, cleaner. But the Golden State had cracks beneath its pastel surface. The Vietnam War had ended, but paranoia lingered like smog. Nixon's resignation still gnawed at trust and authority. Serial predators, Manson, Zodiac, were reminders that horror didn't stay on television screens. It was real, it was local, and sometimes it knocked on your door. In this brittle atmosphere, the illusion of suburban security was a fragile eggshell just waiting to be stomped on. Sacramento's neighborhoods, with their single-story ranch homes and broad, quiet streets, looked almost cartoonishly safe. They had neighborhood watch signs nailed to telephone poles, backyard pools with inflatable flamingos, PDA meetings that smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. But those same houses were architectural invitations to intruders. Sliding doors with no secondary locks. Backyards shielded by fences that gave cover as much as privacy. Wide open spaces that let someone disappear into a drainage canal or hop from yard to yard, unseen. And there was something else, something darker, humming in the background of the 70s. The growing sense that the police were losing control. Law enforcement agencies were siloed, bickering about jurisdiction, failing to share information. What happened in one county might never reach the ears of detectives in the next. A predator with enough cunning could play them against each other, like mismatched chess pieces. The residents didn't know this. They tucked their kids in at night, watered their lawns, and assumed that bad things happened elsewhere. Big cities, sketchy alleys, never the quiet cul-de-sacs where everyone waved at each other during evening walks. They didn't realize they were about to become test subjects in a nightmare experiment. What happens when terror is introduced into a place designed to resist the very idea of it? The Golden State Killer didn't just break into homes. He dismantled a culture of trust, brick by brick, until the very things people thought made them safe, family, neighbors, routine, became the stage upon which fear was performed. His reign wasn't only about violence. It was about rewriting the psychological map of California itself. And once that script had been written, it could never be erased. Joseph James DeAngelo, a name that sounds like it should belong to the kind of man who waves at his neighbors while watering the lawn. And in many ways, that's exactly who he was. A former Navy man, a police officer, a family man. He wore the mask of normalcy with such conviction that no one in his orbit suspected what seethed beneath. Imagine being the guy who grills hamburgers at a neighborhood cookout while secretly cataloging the floor plans of every house in attendance. Born in 1945, DeAngelo grew up in an America that was both rebuilding and unraveling. Accounts from those who knew him as a child describe flashes of cruelty, animal abuse whispered about in the shadows, eruptions of temper that seemed to crack open something primal. But like many predators, he learned young how to compartmentalize. He could be polite, even charming, when it suited him. Yet that smile never quite reached his eyes, and when it slipped, people saw the storm behind it. He studied criminal justice. Of all things, imagine the irony. The man who would later torment an entire state once carried a badge, patrolled neighborhoods, and pretended to uphold the very laws he was rehearsing how to break. Former colleagues recalled his short fuse, his eruptions over the smallest slight. One remembered DeAngelo fly into a rage as suspected shoplifter, screaming with such venom that it seemed wildly disproportionate. But in the 70s, angry cops weren't an anomaly. They were an institution. Nobody asked too many questions. It's chilling to think about the duality of his existence. By day, he was a protector, wearing a uniform that made people feel safe. By night, he slipped into shadows, transformed into something that fed on vulnerability. When he was eventually fired from a police force for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent, a detail so absurd it sounds like satire, it should have been a red flag. Instead, It became one more overlooked clue in a life stitched together by contradictions. Neighbors decades later would describe him as the cranky guy next door, yelling at kids to stay off his property, throwing tantrums over barking dogs. They thought he was just bitter, maybe a little unhinged, but harmless. Nobody looked at him and thought, here is the man who shattered California's sense of safety. Here's a phantom who whispered into phones and left families broken for generations. The scariest monsters don't lurk in graveyards or wear horns. They mow their lawns. They shop for groceries. They smile at you in the produce aisle. And for more than 40 years, Joseph DeAngelo lived among us, carrying a secret like a second skin, waiting for the day the mask would finally crack. It began quietly, almost unremarkably, in the Sacramento suburbs of 1976. At first, the reports didn't sound like a serial predator. They sounded like pranks gone sour, a prowler peering through windows, strange phone calls, heavy breathing or silence so long and deliberate it made the hair on the back of your neck rise, items displaced inside homes, as if someone had entered only to move a chair or leave a drawer half open. The police chalked it up to teenagers. Neighbors shrugged, but the tension thickened, slow and suffocating, until it reached a breaking point. That summer, a young woman living alone awoke to the sound of footsteps in her hallway. By the time she opened her eyes, he was already there, mask glinting faintly in the darkness, knife in hand. She wasn't killed. She survived. But she became the first official victim in a spree that would escalate beyond comprehension. His ritual was as precise as clockwork. He targeted homes with easy access points, sliding doors, backyards shrouded in trees. He stalked for weeks, studying schedules. Once inside, he tied victims with shoelaces or cord, sometimes using towels or curtains ripped from their own homes. Then came the psychological torture. He whispered threats. He pretended to leave, only to return moments later and watch as hope drain from their eyes. He made families listen as he rummaged through their kitchens, eating their food while they lay helpless. Sacramento had no blueprint for this. Home invasions weren't supposed to look like this. They were supposed to be quick smash and grabs, not hours-long symphonies of fear. And yet, here was someone treating suburbia as his personal hunting ground. As the months bled into years, his attacks multiplied. He became known as the East Area Rapist, and the name itself spread like a stain across the community. Couples began sleeping with guns under their pillows. Hardware stores couldn't keep deadbolts and window locks in stock. The suburbs, those manicured symbols of safety, were suddenly fortresses under siege. One chilling pattern emerged. He often targeted couples. He would tie the man, stack dishes on his back, and warn that if even one plate fell, the woman would die. It wasn't just cruelty. It was performance. They are designed to humiliate, to dominate. This wasn't about opportunism. It was about control, absolute and unrelenting. The first disturbance wasn't simply the invasion of homes. It was the invasion of certainty. Suddenly, every creak in the night could be him. Every shadow in the yard might be his. And though police set up task forces, patrolled neighborhoods, even launched sting operations, he was always 2 steps ahead, always watching, always gone before they arrived. The disturbance had become a storm, and California would never be the same. By the late 1970s, the East Area Rapist had become a specter. But the problem wasn't just that he was clever, it was that he was unknowable. Every crime scene offered breadcrumbs, but no trail. Witnesses remembered flashes, a mask, a voice, a car parked too long outside a street. But those fragments never formed a coherent image. Some describe a man in his 30s, others guessed 40s. Some said he had a lisp. Others claimed the voice was smooth, almost charming. The contradictions piled up like bodies in the morgue, messy, confusing, horrifying. And then came the letters. Police received notes at precincts. Typed, clean, cruel. Letters that hinted at knowledge only someone inside the house could possess. Letters that mocked detectives for their incompetence. At first, investigators wondered if they were hoaxes. But then, the letters started referencing details from crimes the media hadn't reported. Someone was watching, reading, waiting to see how the story unfolded, and feeding off the chaos. The victims themselves were fractured. Survivors' testimonies didn't always match, sometimes contradicting one another in small, unsettling ways. One woman said he lingered in the kitchen humming. Another claimed he whispered her name repeatedly. One of the more harrowing accounts included the victim hearing him laughing softly as her husband lay bound and trembling, and yet no one could verify whether he actually spoke to her or simply let her fear fill the void. Public reaction was a mix of fascination and terror. The newspapers ran lurid headlines, spreading the myth of the masked predator. Communities held late-night meetings, and some residents armed themselves in a near-constant vigil. Yet, for all the fear and paranoia, no one could predict where he would strike next. Suburbs, normally predictable, had become a roll of dice. A family in one cul-de-sac could be safe one night, and the next, terror incarnate could slip through their sliding door. Detectives began noticing patterns, odd, meticulous, chillingly personal. He often struck on warm nights. He seemed to prefer homes where the couple had a particular type of window lock or a certain layout of bedrooms. He didn't just commit acts of violence. He curated them, rehearsed them, almost as if he were painting a tableau of fear. And for every lead pursued, for every car watched, for every anonymous tip followed, he was already gone, leaving only a question mark in his wake. The deeper the investigation dug, the more the case unraveled. Every clue seemed like a piece of a puzzle that refused to fit. Law enforcement was staring at a paradox. A man simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, intimate and distant, ordinary and monstrous. And the haunting certainty settled in. This wasn't just a criminal. This was a puzzle crafted by a mind that delighted in the unraveling of everyone else. The investigators called it a nightmare bureaucracy. Jurisdictions bickered like children over a toy, each convinced the other was exaggerating. Riverside, Sacramento, Contra Costa. Counties whose detectives would meet at dusty conference rooms and pass around maps like they were playing a macabre version of Risk. And everywhere, the East Area Rapist, or the Golden State Killer, as he would later be known, slipped through the cracks, exploiting every blind spot. There were theories, endless theories, some so outlandish they read like pulp fiction. Was he a law enforcement officer? A neighbor who knew every layout and every lock? Did he have a network of accomplices? Some thought he had psychological compulsion tied to a traumatic childhood, fascination with fear, domination, and ritual. Others proposed he was a sociopath who kept meticulous journals cataloging his crimes. But each theory collided with the facts, leaving detectives frustrated and the public uneasy. Forensic science in the 1970s offered little solace. Fingerprints were smudged, fibers too generic, DNA science decades away from offering certainty. There were eyewitness sketches, crude and imprecise, none of which led to a meaningful arrest. Every lead seemed to fade like mist. And yet, in the shadows of failure, there were glimpses of brilliance, overlooked clues that would one day become crucial. A latent fingerprint here, a strand of hair there, a piece of tape, a shoe print, a peculiar sequence of letters typed on a machine that police would later trace. Detectives chased behavioral patterns like wild foxes. He struck in bursts, sometimes months apart, sometimes with dizzying speed. He escalated from home invasion to murder, each act more audacious than the last. Psychologists were called in, crafting profiles that could have come from science fiction. Meticulous, controlling, with an obsessive need to dominate and humiliate. They warned of escalation, and they were right. Amateur sleuths, journalists, and true crime obsessives try to fill the gaps. Some constructed elaborate charts, tracing the route of his car, estimating escape times. Others speculated on his identity in public forums, neighbors, teachers, ex-police officers. But the suggestions always fizzled into dead ends. The man behind the crimes was always one step ahead. But the investigation, relentless though disjointed, was slowly building the scaffolding that decades later would finally hold him in place. And yet, amidst all the logic, all the charts, and all the profiles, there was a gnawing, almost irrational sense that something was being overlooked. Not a mistake of technique, but a mistake of imagination. He wasn't just a criminal. He was an organism in a web of fear, thriving because the investigators were human and fallible. And while they were thinking in terms of procedures and evidence, he was thinking in terms of dread, anticipation, and absolute control. It wasn't a breakthrough that came with fireworks. No sirens blaring, no dramatic raid at midnight. It was quiet. A single thread, spun decades earlier, finally pulled taut. In the early 2000s, DNA technology had evolved into something almost magical. A machine that could read the whispers of ancestry and familial ties in a few milliliters of blood, a single hair, a discarded cigarette butt. And suddenly, the past wasn't past. The evidence preserved from crime scenes across California, latent, forgotten, ignored, could now speak. Detectives revisited the files, the fibers, the strands of tape. One by one, the puzzle pieces began to click. And yet, for a long time, the solution hovered just out of reach. The man they were looking for had grown old, gray, and cautious. He lived in plain sight, mowing his lawn, attending meetings at the local hardware store, perhaps laughing at how close they had come, never suspecting that the very fingerprints he left behind in the 70s could betray him decades later. Then came the genealogy searches. Amateur sleuths had pioneered the method, uploading DNA to public databases, tracing familial lines, and narrowing possibilities until a suspect emerges. The breakthrough wasn't a dramatic chase. It was hours of painstaking work, combing through birth records, death certificates, and family trees. And like some cosmic justice, the breakthrough led straight to Joseph DeAngelo, a man who had once worn a badge to enforce the law, now trapped by the law of science. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. Quiet streets, no chase, no gunfire. DeAngelo, 72 years old, was taken into custody in his own driveway. Neighbors gawked, unable to reconcile the image of the cranky old man yelling at his dog with the shadowy specter that had haunted California for decades. And in that moment, the psychological pressure, the fear, the endless questions, all of it found a physical form in a single man, standing bewildered before the law he had once sought to manipulate. But even in that moment, something broke in the narrative. How could one person carry such a career terror? How could someone live a lifetime of lies without ever slipping? The questions didn't evaporate with the arrest. They multiplied. Victims who had waited decades for closure were confronted with a man who had aged quietly while they carried the scars. And the legal system, tasked with translating terror into justice, suddenly had to reckon with decades of accumulated trauma, evidence, and human failure. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer had rewritten the rules. And for 40 years, the world had been watching a ghost that, finally, was made flesh. But the story wasn't just about capture. It was about the unraveling of an illusion, the collapse of a carefully constructed persona, and the extraordinary irony that the monster had been exposed not by force, but by the relentless patience of science catching up to obsession. The court proceedings were surreal. Imagine a room filled with the hushed whispers of decades-long fear, families perched on the edge of memory and terror, and a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting control, suddenly shuffling in a prison jumpsuit, pale and frail. Joseph DeAngelo entered the courtroom, and the weight of history pressed down on him. Not like vengeance, but like truth, immovable, cold, undeniable. The confessions that followed were meticulous, eerily calm. He recounted the invasions, the murders, the stalking, the humiliation of families in ways so detailed it made you question the boundaries of human depravity. Some victims listened, some stared at the floor, some wept. And for each account, there was a gnawing tension. This was a man who had disappeared into decades of suburban anonymity, now laid bare in a quiet courtroom that smelled faintly of polished wood and fear. Yet even with confessions, the case didn't settle neatly. There were hundreds of small questions that lingered, little horrors that no confession could fix, which of the early attacks might never be fully accounted for. How many nights did children wake to shadows that weren't yet remembered by police reports? Which pieces of evidence, lost or degraded over time, would never tell their stories? Justice, when measured against decades of terror, seemed insufficient. A word too small to capture would have been taken. California, and indeed the nation, watched as the final sentence was handed down. Multiple life terms, no possibility of parole. The monster was locked away, and yet the aftermath stretched further than prison walls. Survivors carried the imprint of years of fear, the subtle, insidious trauma of living in a world where a predator could shape entire neighborhoods with just a threat of presence. And the public, meanwhile, had witnessed the strange, almost poetic victory of science over deception, proof that even the most meticulous evil can be undone by patience and ingenuity. Still, the case is a reminder that resolution rarely feels clean. Newspapers ran stories, documentaries dissected motives, podcasts replayed the events. And while the legal system could declare closure, the human psyche is far less tidy. Victims, families, neighbors, they were forever changed by a man who had once walked silently beside them. There's a psychological residue that no courtroom, no DNA match, no confession could ever scrub away. In the end, the Golden State Killer was caught, tried, and sentenced. But the echo of his presence, the whispered threats, the sliding doors, the terror of ordinary nights, lingers. Questions remain about the precise mechanics of some crimes, the details lost to time, the choices made in investigations that might have sped his capture. And maybe that is the point. Even when monsters are caught, their shadows stretch long and dark, touching every life that once brushed too closely against them. California breathed differently after his capture. Suburbs once careful and polite now spoke in hushed tones about vigilance, about locks, about the thin line separating normal life from nightmare. Parenting manuals, true crime documentaries, and community meetings all began citing his crimes, not as stories of sheer terror alone, but as lessons in attention, awareness, and grimly, the persistence of evil. The Golden State Killer didn't just invade homes. He rewrote the psychological geography of a state. Victims faced a long, jagged road of recovery. Post-traumatic stress became their companion, sometimes manifesting in insomnia, hypervigilance, and mistrust of even those they loved. One woman, decades after the fact, recounted that even the smell of freshly baked bread would send her mind spiraling back to the kitchen where it stood, silent and hungry. Families reconstructed routines, tried therapy, sometimes moved entirely. The criminal had left an invisible mark as indelible as any scar. Law enforcement underwent reflection. 2. Department began sharing DNA evidence. Cross-jurisdictional databases became standard, and forensic genealogy emerged as a legitimate, life-altering tool. In a way, the monster had inadvertently forced the evolution of policing. His crimes were the catalyst for methods that would catch other cold cases, crimes that might have remained buried without the shadow he cast. Public fascination also endured, sometimes uncomfortably so. Documentaries, books, and podcasts dissected the minutiae of his crimes, the ritualistic nature, the pacing, the psychological warfare. True crime aficionados debated ethics, empathy, and obsession. And amidst the fascination lay a sobering lesson. Evil can be banal, domestic, almost laughably ordinary in its outward guise, yet catastrophic in its execution. A man mowing his lawn, attending town meetings, and flipping burgers in the kitchen could also be a decades-long architect of terror. Yet perhaps the most chilling legacy is a reminder of patience, both his and the investigators. He demonstrated the terrifying advantage of observation and persistence, while law enforcement and science demonstrated a slower, sometimes painstaking counterbalance. The unrelenting pursuit of truth, 40 years of waiting, of holding on to hope amid horror, culminated in the arrest, but the memory of those decades of uncertainty remains a shadow over the communities he touched. And so the Golden State Killer story exists as both a cautionary tale and a testament to human ingenuity. It is a reminder that evil can dwell quietly in plain sight, and that sometimes justice arrives not in moments of heroism, but as the inevitable consequence of diligence, patience, and the inexorable march of progress. It's tempting to close the book on Joseph DeAngelo and declare the matter settled, but some stories refuse tidy endings. Imagine the streets of Sacramento, of Ventura, of Auburn, once silent witnesses to his prowling, carrying invisible echoes of footsteps that never left a mark, of doors that clicked shut behind an unseen hand. The horror wasn't just the crimes themselves. It was the knowledge that for decades, fear was a constant tenet in ordinary lives. And even now, when windows lock, dogs bark, and alarms chirp, the shadow of that vigilance remains. There's a cruel irony here. The man who meticulously studied families, who traced routines, who curated fear as an art form, was undone by the very tools of ordinary life: DNA, public records, curiosity, and the perseverance of others. The predator who once turned suburban serenity into an exhibition of terror ultimately fell to the quiet, relentless march of technology and human obsession with truth. It is a victory, yes, but one tinged with the bitter knowledge of what he stole in the meantime: years, trust, innocence, and the fragile illusion of safety. Some survivors describe the aftermath as a kind of cognitive dissonance. They feel relief, yet find themselves haunted by memories that no arrest or confession can erase. The human mind, it seems, does not recognize legal closure as closure at all. Instead, trauma lingers, whispers in the corners, and reshapes lives in subtle, indelible ways. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Golden State Killer. Evil is not only in action, but in its enduring shadow. For the rest of us, the story is a mirror. It asks uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people who live among us? How easily can normalcy conceal darkness? And what happens when we ignore the cracks beneath our idealized surfaces? The Golden State Killer was not just a criminal. He was a reminder, an almost metaphysical warning that terror can walk in broad daylight, disguised as a neighbor, a colleague, a friend. And so, as we reflect, it is impossible to separate the ordinary from the monstrous. The killer has been caught, the decades of crime cataloged, the punishment delivered, yet the unease remains. It lingers in quiet cul-de-sacs, in suburban kitchens, in the subtle anxiety of closing a door and checking the lock twice. Because monsters like him are not only defined by what they do, they are defined by what they make us feel long after they are gone. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.